Dadabhai. He was born in 1855 in Bombay. Could you do the next slide, please, Sharon? Or whoever's doing it. Now, he was born into a poor family, a priestly family, in fact, because he came from a group called the Parsis, which means people from the land of Pars or Persia. They settled on the west coast of India in about the 930s, as far as we can tell from records. I've lived there as a kind of small community who kept themselves ever since. He came from a priestly family, and they traced their origins back at least the 1200s, which was pretty good in those days, given records were very sparse. A poor family, and he lived in what was then the country ruled by the East India Company. I'm not sure how much you're aware of that, but based in the 1750s, the East India Company began to sort of set up trading posts in eastern India, in the Bengal region. And gradually by takeover and by expansion, they just began to take over the rest of the country in stages. It's quite it's unusual in the history of the world, really, because they are a public limited company, and yet they conquered India. I mean, at one point, they had a standing army bigger than the rest of the British Army. And during the Napoleonic Wars, the ones that happened in the 1800s, the East India Company conquered more territory in India in 7 years than Napoleon ever did in his whole of his campaigns across Europe in the 20 years time he had. So the biggest army in the world, probably, and certainly one of the biggest in Europe, and then conquered more territory than Napoleon did. So it was an unusual setup. And Dadabhai's family this was the 1800s, so by 1824, we believe his family, who were living on the west coast of India, had to go to Bombay because, being a private company, they weren't so concerned about the welfare of people. The first concern, being a company, was actually returns to its shareholders back in London. And this led to, with some exceptions, a quite kind of disdainful at times, or certainly dismissive attitude towards the local people. And we think that what happened in the 1824, there was a famine in that part of India, the western coast, and it forced the family, which was a father, mother, and Dadabhai, to come to Bombay to try and get money, basically to live, as there was no kind of backup otherwise. So he was born into this sort of poorish family in what was called a native town in Bombay in 1825, into the country land ruled by the East India Company. That meant also, from his point of view, there was little in terms, his family's point of view, there was little in terms of social or educational facilities around. So his father died at the age of when Dadabhai was 4, which left him with a bereaved mother, a widowed mother, and one child. And she first of all got him into a local school where a meta or teacher took him under his wing. And he put him forward for the kind of Native Education Association's local schools, primary schools in effect. Now, there were some good exceptions to this rule. And the East India Company had begun to sort of realise in about the 1800s that, having conquered this vast territory, and I take vast, it's present-day India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Burma, the whole Indian subcontinent, in effect. They began to realise that they couldn't just treat this as a company, they had to treat it as an administration running a country as well as trading. And there was a kind of curious mismatch over the years as time went by in how they did this. But one of the things that some of them did was to set up more education provision for natives. And that's the term used in those days for anybody who was native born to that country. And these first examples gave Dadabhai's family an opportunity to get him into school, where he did well. And in fact, there's a quote from a lady who visited the school when he was about 5 or 6, Mrs. Postans, who said in her book, which is called Western India, she met a little boy with an overhanging forehead and small sparkling eyes. And she recalled that he often took the first step forward when a question was posed, and often after deep thought. And he gave his answer before anyone else. She said, this little fellow seemed wholly animated with desire of excelling, and his mental capabilities promised him a rich reward, which was a pretty good description of Dadabhai. In that school, the same person met then told his mother about the opportunities going. Now, there was a governor of Bombay called Mount Stuart Elphinstone, and he was around at the same time. And he was concerned about the education of people, local people, and he wanted to see some provision put in place. And in fact, there is nowadays a place still in Mumbai called the Elphinstone Institute. And I've been, it's an old Victorian building sort of set in the street. And it basically showed the fruits of his endeavours, because the Elphinstone Institute became to be a place of further education where local people could get educated. So the Meta and Dadabai's mother put forward for a bursary or grant and to get him into the Elphinstone Institute. And Dadabai was successful. So he was along with a kind of first group of people from the native community who got into what you might call Western education. The educators were people who had a view that reform and change was needed in India. And so they were what you might call, in those days, the radicals. The radicals being a term that was often used in the 19th century for people who wanted to advance social and educational and other societal matters. And because of that, they were quite socially minded, socially what's the word I want? Sort of adept, and the pupils picked that up. And so what Dadabai had was a group around him who were telling him about things like learning, education, the rights of people, the need to be able to represent yourself, the need for social reform. So by the time he came to be a young man, this kind of mindset had been embedded into him by the opportunities given by these people who were working in a society where there was not much opportunity. They became kind of the reformers of their day. And it led Dadabai to doing quite a bit of social reform in his early years. I'm talking about from the age of about 20 onwards. And this social reform affected 4 or 5 areas, as he described himself. There was education around political needs. So the East India Company had a charter given every 20 years. The last one was in 1833, next one was due in 1853. And this was a grant from the government to run the country as they wished. And Dadabai and others were campaigning in 1852 to ask for proper representation of the needs of the native people, Indian people, in the new charter, to recognise sort of basic statutes, basic rights under law, under owning property, and other things that were required and weren't given to them automatically in those days. So there was a political reform. He also looked about the religious reform. His people, having come from Persia and having lived in the country for 1,000 years, had adopted many sort of characteristics or many habits that were probably not true to his own religion, the Parsi or Zoroastrian people. And he therefore set up about a reforming agenda with other people and to bring it back to what he called its pristine condition where it was originally. They had to rely on sort of old writings and books. And because some of the other sort of customs were so embedded in the religion, it took quite a while to change even some of them. But that was also part of his sort of his general approach. There was also the social. One of the amusing ones here is that in those days, when men and women sat down to dinner, they would be there for the first course, and the women would retire to the upper room for the dessert. And Dadabai and others were saying, this is right. So they began to institute meals where men and women stayed through for the whole meal. And that worked. And as I called it in my book, everyone got their just desserts. But also, more importantly, probably, he and other guys around the time began to set up education for women. There were no girls' schools of any sort. The schools themselves were just, on the basis of just starting in this community, but no girls' education. So he and others used to go around literally at 7 o'clock in the morning, knocking on the doors of local people saying, can we give your daughter some education before going to work? And they had the first sort of tranche of about, I think, 44 Parsi and 24 Hindu girls in this one. Now, this actually took hold and people began to support this. And what happened was that the main sort of the merchants around the place called the Shettiers, the main sort of native Indian merchants, as well as some of the British benefactors, began to put money into these schools. And over time, these schools began to sort of develop into formed institutions. So that began sort of the first advancement for women in those days. And then the other one was probably just the educational, political and social. That's the main ones, in fact. But because of this, Dadabai was at the kind of cutting edge of development in the country, and he became acutely aware, or very aware, of how the East India Company and the British government, in some ways, were kind of disinterested parties. They ruled the country, but didn't have much of an ongoing program of help or benefit for the locals. But in this time, he also was asked by 2 brothers called the Karma brothers to come and open up the first Asian business in the UK. It's called Karma Brothers, and it opened up in 1855. And they were middlemen. They traded in all kinds of goods. They set up offices, in fact, in London and Liverpool. And just to give an idea of Dadabai's character, they dealt at one point in these spools of ribbon. They're about 100 yards long, spools of ribbon. Being the middlemen, they weren't too concerned if the supplier didn't give 100 yards to the buyer. As long as they got the purchase made and the transfer made, they were okay. But Dadabai thought that's not quite right. And there's an account of him sitting up at night, literally pulling out these spools of ribbon and measuring them to make sure they're 100 yards long. I'm not sure if they all were or not, but that's kind of the thing he would do. He's conscientious in his ways. Now, this business carried on for a few years, but he and the others weren't of the same kind of ilk. And in fact, this was the time when Dadabai began to pick up on the fact that in Britain, the kind of views of the community or the parliament, politics, the people were different to those in India. In India, you had a group which was called, in fact, in those days, Anglo-Indians, meaning sort of Europeans in India who basically ruled the country. And they had a much more sort of hidebound approach to how to deal with the country than the British living in Britain. And he began to sort of hear the speeches of people like Gladstone and others and realised that there was a difference in how they viewed it. A bit distant, but perhaps not so oppressive. And he began to think about this as being a way of trying to open up the need, not just for trade, therefore, but the need for opening up what was going on in the Indian subcontinent amongst the people who quite often didn't know what was happening in the first place. So he began to open up this sort of issues with people. And so although the business part of the work finished in 1858, he was to carry on doing this. He held kind of a second front, really, in Britain to campaign for the needs of India. And this, in a way, led to him, that characterized a lot of the later part of his life, him sort of staying in Britain and campaigning on the British soil rather than Indian soil. They went back and forth between two. One little story about his family at this time was having come across to Britain in 1855 and of the Parsi religion, the expectation was you would not marry outside your religion. And the rumour got back in about 1859 that was saying that Dadabai is going to meet a white British lady, he's going to convert to Christianity and marry her. This wasn't true, but it caused a lot of upset and unhappiness in the family. And he had to rush back during all this to kind of assure his family, it means his wife, who I should have added he was betrothed to his wife when he was 11 and she was 7, was the norm in those days. And so he kind of properly married in adulthood, and she was now settled back in Bombay with the mother-in-law, who had been a strong sort of influence on Dadabai's life since his father died, and whom he much respected. And he had to go back and assure both women that he was having no intention about marrying someone from the British community and converting to Christianity. But because of this, he also then brought his family over in 1859 as he continued to work, and he set up his own business then called Dadabai Naroji & Co. With the family in Hornsey in London. And this was a time of family life. He had 2 children there, a son called Adi and a daughter called Shirin. His wife Gulbai was not of the same kind of mindset as Dadabai. It wasn't her sort of interest in seeing change in parliament or government. She was much more kind of a home person, and it led to really sort of an ongoing, not split, but definitely not a kind of a meeting of minds over the rest of their lives in many ways. And in fact, she returned with the 2 children in 1860 or 1861, and the 3rd daughter was born in India, in fact, when she went back. So this was one area where Dadabai was sometimes a absent father, I'm afraid to say. But on the other hand, he kept up a regular correspondence with all his children, and in fact his grandchildren, and there are reams of letters between him and them, which show an ongoing concern for the family, but albeit a more distant than face-to-face kind of contact. The other thing that happened was that in 1861, the American Civil War came about, and the cotton imports from America dried up, and India became the boom place to be for a short while during the American Civil War. But in 1865, when the American Civil War ended, the Indian trade died off, and basically his company went bust. And it took him 15 years to pay off all the debts. So that was an additional strain to him. But by then he was much more focused on this kind of political social reform, and that was what he stayed in Britain for. If I could take the next slide, please. So two key things came to Dadabhai in these kind of 1850s, 1860s and onwards. One was the fact that poverty in India didn't have to be so draconian as it was. He began to realize that no one kept proper accounts of what's happening in India. There were what called the blue books, which were the kind of the East India Company and the government's books about how money was being used. But to give you two examples, when projects were launched in India, for instance, the building of the railways, the Indian government was in a sense made to accept loans from the UK and then to pay back quite hefty interest rates on those loans. Now, these loans came out of the taxation on the people, and there was no real checks and balances. There was no proper making sure that the loans were fair or reasonable, that the interest rates charged were reasonable. And also these repayments were counted as exports from India, when they weren't in any way exports. They were just a way of getting money out of India back into Britain. And also the way that the figures were worked out in terms of what people could afford to pay in taxes was very rudimentary. And Dadabhai began to work out from his own work figures from either across India or in one case a study about one state, the Rajput state. And he said at one time he was, I suppose, shocked to find, and this was in this, he wrote one book in 1870 called The Wants and Means of India, and then followed up in Poverty in India in 1878, that he worked out that the yearly income of the average person in India was about 40 shillings, which is about 20 rupees. Now, to give a comparison, those are the old terms, and it was pounds, shillings and pence in those days. In the UK, the average income was about £33 a year, whereas in India, that 40 shillings equated to about £2 a year. So there was no way that people could make the basics of life in many ways. And they weren't really allowed to either. That was the problem. Money was going out because India was assumed to be wealthy. And I have to say that when the East India Company came to the Western Bengal in the 1750s, 1770s, 1780s, a vast amount of wealth was then apparent. India was actually, according to the best data we have, probably the third richest country in the world in those days. By the time the British left in 1947, it was impoverished. But in that time, it was a bleed and therefore a drain on the country. This is what Dadabhai was writing about. He wrote again and again. He wrote up a publication, as you can see there, called Poverty in India in 1878. He kept doing this over his life, and the one called Poverty and Un-British Rule in India in 1901 was a seminal book. I mean, in 1986, the UN adopted it as saying it's one of the books that compares with Roundtree's studies of poverty in, I think, London or York in about the same time. It was really seen as a masterpiece, but on the other hand, it was very detailed. It's a very sort of boring thing to go through. But because of this, Dadabhai was fixed on trying to get this imbalance in trade readdressed, and also to appreciate the fact that local people in India had no way of paying the taxes and not going under. And this showed in terms of like famines. I mentioned about the famine that brought his family down from probably west coast of India down to Bombay. There were other famines too. One of those ones was the Bengal famine in the 1890s, where millions of people, as far as I know, died. And the reason was that if you had a basic subsistence, when the crops were failing, you had nothing to buy the food in the stores because the prices went up. And the government didn't usually release much supplies, grain or rice, to people to live on as a kind of emergency measure. It was a really sort of dire situation, which would not be better by the fact that the response was either none at all or too little and too late, and that's what caused famines. If they had been allowed to, let's say, local people had been allowed to do more in terms of jobs in industry, developing small businesses, and be able to fend for themselves, they may have not been the same kind of results as they were. So this was a real kind of like marring of the point that India was not managed in many ways well. I have to say as a counterpoint that India did benefit from other ways in terms of British rule, in that there was no proper government, there was no proper legislative power, no proper judges, courts, that kind of thing, to systems to give fair trial, and those things were brought in under British rule. So there were ways that Dadabhai would say there's not all bad, but on the other hand, this was a kind of a running saw that happened throughout the time. He also then brought in the thing about reform of the entry to the covenanted civil service. So the civil service was a a body of administrators basically who ran the country for the East India Company, and at the upper end of it, it was called a covenanted civil service. You covenanted to work for them and to work in a way that met the needs of the company, really. There'd be the equivalent, I suppose, these days in the civil service nowadays of maybe the SCS and certainly sort of like the directors, the director generals, and the permanent secretaries, and kind of roughly equivalent. And there were no natives in those ranks at all. And the reason that happened is because of various reasons. But basically, the exam to get into that covenanted civil service were held in Hailey College back here in Britain. And a lot of people in those days would not cross what was called the Black Water, mainly for the Hindus. They were just averse to doing it. To travel from India to London to Britain would have been averse to their own sort of beliefs. Plus, the cost of it was enormous for them. They couldn't really do it. And also other things were done. So when Dadabhai was taking up a case of a gentleman called Mr. Wadia who tried to get into the to do the exams in Britain, the East India Company suddenly said, well, actually, the upper age of application has now been dropped 2 years, and he was suddenly, from being in the frame for doing it, he was suddenly found to be too old to go in for it. So there were kind of ruses and changes that were made to keep people out, and this became also the second most important issue that he campaigned on during his life. He also wanted to point out that the two were tied together because at one point it was estimated that the price of a civil servant or a covenanted member of the civil service in India ran to about £18,000 a year. Now, this was paid again from the taxes imposed on the local people. And as a rough comparison, that's easily about £200,000, maybe £300,000 by today's money, being paid for each of these higher paid civil servants living and running the country in India. It was just a real strain. So you lost two things, he said. One is the ability to learn how to sort of run and rule a country yourself, and two, that just the financial drain carries on unmitigated. I would say that, surprisingly enough, at first his papers and his work on the drain theory got little response. But in 1882, a member of the Viceroy, the Viceroy was the kind of British representative in India. There was a Secretary of State for India back in the UK, and the Viceroy was the sort of governor of the country based in India. And he was on the Viceroyal committee, and he worked out in 1882 that he reckoned the figures came to about 54 shillings or 27 rupees. So not much up on Dadabhai's figures. But again, even despite that being recognised by them, the authorities didn't do much to change the actual reasons for this, the extreme poverty. So these became, as I said, ongoing concerns for Dadabhai. If I could take the next slide, please. So, yeah, Parliament. These issues, being ones that Dadabhai wanted to do, and being him based in the UK a lot of the time, brought him into circles which you wouldn't normally come across. So he began to talk to leading radicals of the day. There's a man called Birdman. There were others too, who were, a few of them MPs, who were very concerned about the state of affairs in India. And his campaigning also led to sort of organising of groups in India. There was different subgroups. There were three main centres in India in a way. There was Bombay, Calcutta, and maybe Madras, which is where the main governors were held too. And they began to look at doing things more sort of integrated, more nationally, campaigning on the need for Indian needs to be fairly heard and reflected in the way the country was governed. I'd add as an aside, by the way, that Dadabhai was in the country in the UK when the Indian Mutiny Uprising happened. He wasn't directly involved, but this again just showed the need for reform being there. The uprising was crushed quite heavily in 1859, and in fact at that point the East India Company lost their charter, and from then on the British government became the rulers and the administrators of the country. But matters didn't change that much in terms of how things happened on the ground. So this group was beginning to protest to the British government to say we need to have change and reform. And in 1884, a gentleman called Octavian Hume, who was a Scottish man living in India, who was actually very moved by the fact that this reform was not happening, called together a group of these kind of Indian counterparts to try and form a national organisation. And in fact, that organization became the precursor to the Indian National Congress, which ran from about 1886 to the First World War. And you've heard of the Congress Party in India. It kind of drew its roots from this time, this Indian National Congress. And so he began to sort of form them into like a group, a corpus group, and also to have an agenda for what was wanted. So that sort of formulated a kind of an Indian desire to be properly represented in the herd. At the same time, a gentleman called Ram Mohan Ghosh stood for election in 1885 in Deptford and didn't succeed. But it again gave the idea to people that perhaps we can get Indians into the British Parliament to meet our aims, and therefore it began to be sort of thought about in those terms. When you add that to the mix about Dadabhai being very concerned about these things about the drain theory and the entrance to the civil service and his ongoing campaigning for other issues too, it began to become a mix that got together in about the 1884, 1885, as far as we can tell, to put it into his mind, perhaps I should stand for being an MP too. And there were other people saying, yes, go for it. And they introduced him to the Liberal Party in particular. There were two main parties in those days, Liberal and Conservative. By the 1860s, 1870s, they were the two main parties in British politics, to go and become a Liberal MP. And because of these combination of factors, he put himself forward for election, and he was unsuccessful in Holborn, where he was first adopted as a potential MP, but he cut his teeth there. He was up against a quite strong Conservative majority, but he did well. He increased his vote and led him to thinking about the next seat to go for. In the meantime, in 1888, this Prime Minister of the day, Lord Salisbury, gave a speech in Edinburgh, referring back to this 1886 election in Holborn, and saying to the effect that this black man could never have won a seat in Britain because he was not of the same type and ilk as us, and he would never be able to sort of fit in the way we wanted to fit in. That caused a storm, and it led to lots of newspaper articles. It led to lots of people saying that was wrong, Lord Salisbury, as much as those who said he was right to say that. But it showed the kind of the tenor of the day that, you know, these people coming from these Asiatics, these people coming elsewhere should not be able to sort of take up a seat in our country. And other people saying to say, yes, he will do. Now, in terms of getting a seat, Dadabhai eventually narrowed down to central Finsbury, which is in sort of north central London. And even there, he had problems because the local party then comes into play. He had to sort of twice try and get himself adopted as the local campaigner. And the first time round, there were quite a bit of bitter infighting, actually, and the gentleman concerned, his supporters, were using terms like black man and Hottentot at times too, which was not necessary. But I have to say that wasn't the majority of people too. But there was always that undercurrent of that kind of racial tenor in all his situations. And he eventually had to sort of, in a sense, overcome the objections for that person's campaign, as Mr. Ford, his name was, and then was adopted by the party to then be their prospective member of parliament. And then in 1891, a second person came out, Mr. Reed came out with his group, saying that he should be taking this seat forward, not Dadabhai Naoroji. And this led to a lot of correspondence and agitation involving the Central Liberal Party, who was obviously could pull the strings, but didn't always pull the strings, to say that no, Dadabhai was fairly elected. Why has this happened? But the other party is saying no, he has not got the right kind of prospectus. He's not got the right kind of program. He won't reflect the people properly. And it was coming to a real head. I mean, Dadabhai was threatening, in fact, in 1892 to just publish his private letters sent to Liberal Party officials to say, I have been told that I was going to be the member of the prospective candidate, and now this happened, it's gone backwards. Eventually, a gentleman called Mr. Corson came in and persuaded the other contestant, this is Mr. Reeve, to step aside, which he did do. But that was only 6 weeks before the election itself was called. So this was a very tense time. It was actually from 1888 to 1892 that Dadabhai was trying to fight in his own party to be properly adopted as the prospective MP. Once that was cleared, he had 6 weeks to try and win an election in an area which was never done before. And to be fair, the first contender, Mr. Ford, came round and rallied behind Dadabhai, as did other members who had actually fought against him before. They said it's our duty to actually support you. The other people who came around him, by the way, were women, because Dadabhai had shown through things like campaigning for women's needs in terms of education. He campaigned for women's issues over here with Josephine Butler, Florence Nightingale, and others. And they were also very, very sort of pertinent to his campaign succeeding by going around talking to people, whipping up support in this contest. But it was a tough contest. The sitting MP was a gentleman called Captain Penton. If you know London, that part of London around King's Cross, there's a road called Pentonville Street, and that was because his family had owned landlords. They were landlords, owned about 400 properties around that area, and that's why the street is called Pentonville nowadays. And they were sort of obviously campaigning on a Conservative ticket. Dadabai's probably won because of a couple of factors. One is he was in the Liberal Party, which was very strong on Home Rule for Ireland, which was the big issue of the day. And he was supporting that, and they in turn wanted to support him where they could do. But he also just campaigned on the issues of the day, an 8-hour working day, the setting up of a London County Council, so the predecessor to our GLA these days, and other issues. And by those means, he won. And he won by a narrow majority. And his name was then in the papers given as Mr. Narrow Majority as opposed to Mr. Naroji. He won by 3 votes. The other side then took him to court to say this was done illegally, and they wanted to see they have the results reviewed, which they did. But in December in 1892, the court eventually decided there was no case to hold, and its majority went up to 5. I have to say in those days, the total electorate was about 8,000. So having a narrow majority was not so unusual in those days as it would be these days, but he won by 3 and then by 5 votes. In Parliament, he set about doing 2 main things. Again, going back to think about sort of the covenant of civil service and also the drain theory. The vote on simultaneous exams was set up he set up actually a bill to ask that this be discussed in Parliament as a bill. He knew well that the Secretary of State actually already had the powers to provide for other people to take the entry exams for the covenant of civil service, but it wasn't being done. This was to generate a real sort of stir on the issue. He also set up with a few other people, particularly a man called William Wedderburn and W.C. Kane, the Indian Parliamentary Committee, and that grew in fact to 150 people at one time. It really became a significant bloc in Parliament. There were MPs concerned about this, and they pushed through for a resolution on simultaneous exams after his debate on the bill was knocked back, and they got a vote, and they won by 84 to 78 on having a resolution that these exams should be looked at again. This caused a stir for the Liberal government, Governor Gladstone, because that was his own party. And really, unfortunately, what they did was they said, we heard what the vote says, we heard what Parliament's saying, we must go and consult. And they went and consulted with the Indian government back in India, which was obviously the one who's probably most likely to say not a good idea. And that's what they were saying, in effect. And so this never came to a real fruition, but it did sort of raise the issues, raise the temperature a lot in Parliament. The second one he went for was the Royal Commission, which was basically, I'm sorry, the figures that I wrote, actually 1896 to 1895, 7. The Royal Commission was to look at the wants and needs of India again, and look at basically the drain theory. It was going to be set up, first of all, as a committee, then as a investigation inquiry, but it was decided a Royal Commission because it got going after Dadabai lost his seat. So he lost his seat in 1895, but the Royal Commission ran from 1896 to 1897. Used a lot of his evidence, but there was unhappiness because the committee members, the commission members, want to look at how to improve on, say, wastage, or improve on the use of the money, but not a fundamental review of is this the right burden we put on the people of India, which is what Dadabai and Wedderburn and Kane wanted. They produced their own minority report in this case to say this is what should have been said and what should have been done. But again, it sort of led to something, but not to this the real goal they wanted to get to. So I'd say that summarising Dadabai's role in Parliament, it was actually more the symbolism that in India, when he was elected, the people went cock-a-hoop. I mean, they went really sort of wild in joy. The fact that an Indian had got into the British Parliament, the mother of all parliaments. They sent, for instance, I've been to the local history library in Islington, sent a magnificent carved box inside with photographs of the time of sort of Bombay and the surrounding areas of 1890s. And they gave money to the poor box in Mansion House, and other ways of showing their appreciation for this, because they felt someone was there to now talk about what they needed at the very heart of government. As you can see, it wasn't successful in some ways, but it did cause the right kind of forward momentum. And I think Dadabai was a pioneer who pushed forward the envelope and gave younger Indians the sense that we can go forward in this one. We haven't got to keep sitting in the same situation. If I take the next slide. So after losing the election, as I said, he worked hard on producing papers and going to the Royal Commission. This was 1897. But he also was engineering, he was engendering a new generation of people to think about keeping on this campaign. Now, the International Congress kept going in all this time. That was a kind of the kind of central point for a lot of this in India. They met every year. Dadabhai was actually president for 3 times, in 1886, 1893 when he was an MP, and in 1906. Just saying, back in 1893 when he was an MP, to show the enthusiasm in the country when he was going to meetings, there was usually a 5-hour tailback of him getting through the crowds to the meeting place and getting to the Congress as well. It really was a sort of a boost to morale. But he campaigned there from 1897 onwards with the same issues. This is the drain and the current civil service. He did a lot more in his local kind of people communities. So he was there to help. He had lots of correspondence between individuals who wanted help to the various sort of institutions and bodies that were trying to do the same thing as him. He'd walk around the place talking. One of the things I want to bring out, though, is that in the International Congress in 1906, there had been by then, that was like about 20 years or 30 years after it first started, the growing numbers of the new generations had become more veered towards 2 camps. One was saying enough's enough, the British have to get out. They didn't say that has to be done by violence if necessary, but the words were hanging in the air. That could be by violent means, guns, weapons, grenades, you call it. On the other hand, there were the more moderate types who were saying, you don't go down that route. We still push for change and reform with the British, which is what, in fact, Dadabhai had been doing for the previous half century, from the 1850s onwards. He'd been changing through the institutions rather than just saying, this is enough, push them out, get them out. There was a real contestation between both groups. But they agreed that in the 1906 Congress, when Dadabhai was invited back to be the president, that they had someone whom both sides respected and both sides believed would give them a fair kind of an opportunity to be heard and to take forward what was the right way of doing this. And it's at the 1906 Congress that he first, from a public platform, this was not just from a person's personal letters or things, talked about or asked for Swaraj, which means self-government. So this was the first demand from a kind of public body in India to say to the British government, we want self-government now. As he says, self-government is our hope and our strength and greatness. He also added in, if I'm a Hindu, a Muslim, a Parsi, but above all, I'm an Indian first. He was trying to bring people together to campaign collectively. And it helped for a while, although by about 5 years later, the splits were still there apparent in terms of how people wanted to see change brought about in their country. But this also was just to summarize a part where Dadabhai's character was showing through. He had a real sense, he had a real perseverance in his character. To give an example of that, just back in the 1870s, he was asked to be the prime minister of a princely state. Now, the princely states in India were run on an autonomous basis. They were allowed by the British to keep their running themselves, provided they did it under British hegemony, under British oversight. And he went to try and help change the corrupt practices in that state at the invitation of the Maharaja. He got so far, and in 13 months, him and a few lieutenants got so far in changing some of the corrupt practices, but the Maharaja kept squaring between one thing and then going back to listen to the corrupt officials, then going back to Dadabhai and saying, I want you to do this for me. There was no proper sort of resolution. But Dadabhai kept at it and did bring about his reform. It just says that against the odds, he did that, and his perseverance was there. Secondly, he believed in revival, which meant he said, I believe, even in 1960, I still believe the British will hear a just argument and will still change what they're doing. And he had that kind of sense that would lead to revival for us all. So those are kind of 2 particular traits of his character, which kept him going through. Dadabhai died in 1917, not before writing an 80-page letter to the Viceroy in about 1910, explaining about the wants and needs of India. This is to say that 2 men were particularly influenced by Dadabhai. One on the left, Jinnah, became obviously the founder of Pakistan. The one on the right, Mahatma Gandhi, became the kind of founder of India. I mean, Nehru was the actual prime minister, but Gandhi was the main man behind it all. Jinnah was working with Dadabhai more in the administrative sense of the word. He worked with him during his 1892 election campaign and was rubbing shoulders with him all the time at no times. But Gandhi met him in 1891, and between 1891 and his 1910s, had a regular correspondence with Dadabhai and other campaigners, by the way, and he called him a Dada, which means a father, and he really sort of took his kind of ideas and tutelage from Dadabhai in many ways. So he looked up to him in that way. Okay, if I do the next slide, please. I'm afraid I'm running a bit behind, so I must hurry up.
Yeah, hi, thanks so much for this. This has been incredibly informative and very, very fascinating. I was wondering, either do you want to speed through this next section? Is this on the second MP that you're going to talk about? And if not, we could pause and do a Q&A, and then we can organize a follow-up session for you to cover these next slides if you don't want to rush it. I give you the options, but we have 15 minutes left, and I'm keen for at least 5 minutes because there have been some questions in the chat.
Sorry, yes, it wouldn't take so long with bound degree, but I have overrun, I know. I'll do a quick run through of bound degree at least, just to give an idea, and we'll see what we do after that as well. Just quick to say, he came from a mercantile class. He was born in 1851. He went up, you can see, through the kind of the institutions. He studied law, became a barrister, but he worked for another Thakur or Maharaja of an estate. He brought in constitutional reform, and he defended a defamation case against him and his other reformers, which he won, and it led to a kind of a template for all states to change their ways of working. He was also brought in to help set the Indian colonial exhibition, and he gave money towards the paintings there. And in fact, in the Conference Institute nowadays, there's a corridor of his name called the Bound Degree Corridor. There's always questions about his source of funding, which they said was a bribe or payoff by the Thakur for helping in the first place. And also at the same time, just saying, he's sort of rich and he's going to be supporting the kind of the powers that be, which in that case was the Conservative Party. I'll do the next slide very quickly. He felt that all this sort of liberal stuff, which coming out from Dadabhai, was a real whitewash, and in fact, India would be solid conservative. And he put himself forward for the Conservative Party. He actually helped Dadabhai in his campaign of 1892, but then by 1894 was running to the Conservative Party, saying, look, there are lots of people who don't support this liberal idea. You've got problems with the Indian Parliamentary Committee in Parliament. I will stand and show that Indians can also support conservative values. And he was put himself forward. He was actually put forward for the constituency of Bethnal, North East Bethnal Green, which he won. And it's a quite surprise vote because it was a working class constituency, solid, sort of this liberal, and he won it from the sitting MP. He also got called Mr. Bound Degree because the people back in India didn't like standing for the Conservative, much more standing in a sense against the Congress views and ideas. But I'm going to stop there then, Sharon, and just take any questions and answers there are.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Umar. I feel like, sorry for rushing you, and we can definitely organize a follow-up session because I feel like there's been a lot of appetite. I think at our peak, there was 130 people here listening to you, and a couple of people had to drop off because they have other meetings. Just looking at some of the comments that have come in, there have been some reflecting on racism having a long history and racism being a consequence of the justification of colonialism. There was a question around your book. I don't know if you want to give a bit more detail on the book that you wrote in the 90s and whether it's available in retailers outside of Amazon.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, you could get this book from Amazon, or I'll hold it up. You can probably see, it's not very clear now. It's on the last slide. I'll take the last slide up, actually. If you do the last slide, please. It comes up there. It's published by Hansib.
Sorry.
Go on, if you read the last slide, I'll just show you the booklet. It's published by Hansib. You can also get it on that's it, the two books there. So the book on the left, a biography about Nauroji, published by Hansib, and the booklet on the right, also published by Hansib, but it's a bit hard to get hold of, which is the booklet on Bound Degree. So those are the two publications which I'm basing much of my talk on today. But yeah, very happy to help people who want to get a copy. Just, I suppose, by email, I could try and arrange that too. Was there any other questions about them in particular?
So there's one coming in from Smita saying, what would you say is the legacy of these MPs for UK and India?
Well, actually, funny enough, we're talking at the same time that Rishi Sunak's talking in Parliament, i.e. an Asian MP. And in an indirect way, there wouldn't be probably so many people of Indian extraction in Britain today if these two guys hadn't been campaigning for Indians' needs, because what they did led to a second generation of people campaigning for India's independence. And from that, of course, stems the point that people could then be had greater rights in the world, so to speak, as that. And that, I think, led to the fact that the first MPs from non-white MPs were in fact in 1987. There were a group of about 4 or 6 of them. But these guys, by spurring on people from the past generations to feel that they could push for change with Britain, has led to part of the modern day British landscape. It's not seen so easily because it's like the 1890s and 1900s, but their role was to show that reform is needed, and they were able to give people, and I suppose figureheads as well as campaigners, to rally around and keep that agenda going in those years. As I said, they led to the modern 20th century movements in India, which were mass movements, which neither of these two guys were involved in. They weren't the charismatic characters, which some of the people in the 20th century were, but their work promoted those people to carry on doing it in their own way and led to independence, which then led to proper recognition, if you like, as rights. If they hadn't been around, who knows, we might still have been seeing in British India up until the 1990s or something, the same as of Hong Kong. But because their work was done, it pushed forward the agenda for the British to have to respond to.
Thanks very much, Omar. There's a question about the caste system and whether it was exacerbated by colonial rule and the mischief in how that was handled or not.
That's a question. It's a bit off. I won't say I'm an expert on this one. I don't believe, though, that it was misused, if you like. I mean, I think it was always openly misused. I talked about the princely states, for instance. Yeah, that was more an example of where you could have that misuse, because the British government was saying to princes, you can keep your state, provided you work with us and work in the right kind of way. It meant that the princes, in effect, were honour or hidebound to have to prevent discontent in their own states, because if they had too much discontent, they'd be taken away from their position. So I think that's more a clear example where the British have leaned on people in the right kind of way to make sure there wasn't discontent. But in terms of the 4 main castes or what have you, I'm not sure I know the answers to that one properly in regard to how the British ruled the subcontinent. I think the other one that's always come, of course, is the thing about Hindus and Muslims, that I showed a picture about Jinnah and Gandhi. As you know, that was a picture of showing them with arm around each other. But when it came to the real change, for independence, then Jinnah and the Muslims felt they couldn't trust a Hindu majority parliament or government or country to represent their rights properly. And they campaigned for the need for a second country called Pakistan, of course. It was also in those days East and West Pakistan. And that one, the British government didn't properly address. They didn't really sort of try and dampen down the fires of suspicion enough that it all flared up. And we had the dreadful scenes in 1947 when people were killed in the 1 million or 2 million during the partition era.
Thanks, Omar. There's a question here from Andy on what is the importance of involvement within civic society, such as council and government. So I presume that's the importance of BAME and or non-white people being involved in civic society.
Okay, I presume that means in modern day, not back in those days, I presume.
I think just go with the assumption, and people can type in the chat if they want to contextualize further.
Well, I think going back to those days, I think it was very important. I mean, Dadabhai was involved with 2 gentlemen. I forget what the name. I think it was William Brown, who was from the Caribbean. He became Mayor of Battersea in 1913, for instance. So there was this kind of desire to. They wouldn't call it race in those days. There wasn't a race relations industry in those days, but they're representing people who are of a different colour. And he was supporting him. He went to the International Socialist Council Committee in 1904 in Amsterdam to again campaign for the rights of Indians. So it wasn't so obviously colour bound as we are nowadays, because the concept wasn't there the same way, but they were campaigning for the needs of these people and joining up together. And by doing that, they were saying that we are not here to just be ruled and be, sort of like just not walked over, but just kind of hidden to you. We do need to have representation. We need to have our views taken on board. That was important because it meant that people felt I could do that too once they do that. Now, in the present day, I think it's become more complicated because people are more now involved in quite a few places, local government, central government. There's obviously not a complete representation in Parliament just now. I think it'd be near 60 MPs if it was proper representation against the country's population. So there's also an ongoing push to try and get more people in. But I think that there is not the same kind of issues nowadays. It's not just, it's now reform within the country as opposed to reform of a country in your own country, so to speak, which is a very different situation. I mean, basically what they did was led to the establishment of independence, in effect. Whereas nowadays it wouldn't be the same campaign. It'd be the issue about how do we change, make sure BAME communities are properly represented, and for instance, in the jabs for the vaccine, how to make sure they are getting seen and heard. And it's got recognition at least. That wouldn't be there if there weren't people doing that back in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, talking about the issues in those days and getting them seen that way. It's now more built into the psyche of the people to think it that way. But Dadabai and Banagri decided it's about being a kind of a more Banagri person, did campaign a lot for Indians in South Africa and for education in India to help the people get to a position where they could be self-supporting. So I hope that's briefly answered the question. Maybe I could take that further, but it's quite a big question.
I think it is. We could run an entire whole new session on the reason why this type of issue is important in representation both then and now and the differences. This is quite a specific question. I'm very interested in it, so I hope you can answer it. It's from Civ, from UKGI. Why were both MPs Parsis despite being a very small part of the Indian population? And do you think this was a deliberate decision from the British government, or do you think it was coincidence?
No, it wasn't a decision by the British government. They've come from a quite well, the Parsis benefit in terms of when the British started setting up trade in Bombay, for instance, they weren't so contained by the norms of their religion. They were more able to be middlemen, or not middlemen, but just sort of developers and entrepreneurs, and it benefited in that way. In fact, modern-day Bombay was based on many Parsi entrepreneurs in the 1770s through to the 1850s and 60s. Because of that, they also then became more involved in government and politics because they were better off in many cases. Why they became the only ones and not the other ones, I do not know. In fact, the third MP in Britain in 1922, a guy called Shapurji Saklatvala, was Labour, and in 1924 became communist, and he still won a seat in Battersea. So he was also a Parsi. So you could argue they must have it in their blood. Because how do you explain it? There's no obvious reason except to say that they were vigorous campaigners who worked hard and worked through to become MPs. But there's no reason why they couldn't be someone from another background doing it. It was certainly not a kind of like a pick them out and choose them. No, it was not that at all. It was just that they were in the right place sometimes in the right time. But quite incredible because the party community is very small in India.
Really, really fascinating. Just looking at the chat, we had a lot of comments saying thank you to you, Omar, for such a fascinating, interesting, brilliant presentation. Lots of adjectives there. There's also been some chat about the caste system. So someone's recommended a book. Manisha recommended a book on the annihilation of caste, and they said it's a very great read. But also equally a comment from Benjamin saying let's not be judgmental about the caste system. We need to understand it and how it works in practice. And they've heard some Indians describe it as a kind of trade union system. So that's also a point well received. I think we should draw the session to a close just because we're coming for time. So I guess my key takeaways. I really enjoyed how you contextualized this within colonial India, Omar, and I learned a lot from that historical aspect, I guess, in addition to the MPs and locating their work and highlighting those synergies. I also found it fascinating and not altogether unsurprising about the level of intersectionality there was. So, for example, one of the MPs was very active in promoting women's rights, and other people fighting for other causes also supported kind of more non-white colleagues to be joining them in Parliament, although obviously this is quite a complex mixed story, and you've also highlighted some of the contradictions there with the second MP joining the Conservative Party, despite them initially being slightly anti. And finally, I think that this really brings home just some of the challenges faced, from the beginning of time through to the 1800s when they were facing, joining Parliament to now, and the different issues we face with representation and the importance of just having diverse colleagues in all spaces, being able to contribute to those decision making and still overcoming kind of people's, barriers and the expectations put upon them. So it gave me a lot of food for thought. Even though this was historical, I think it very much has, contemporary relevance. I think that's come through from the chat too. So we'll close there, but I just wanted to thank Omar. I don't know if everyone can unmute their mics and give him a little clap, but this has been a really great first session, and let's discuss about whether to do a second one. I think there's definitely appetite from the audience.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Care.
Bye.
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 Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sharon and team.